Welcome to the Demeere podcast. We talk about martial arts, self-defense, and a whole lot more. And now your host, Demeere.
Hello everybody and welcome to episode 20 of the podcast. So in this one I'm going to talk a little bit about how to take notes for your martial arts or self-defense practice. But before we do that, just some housekeeping stuff. Let me get right into it. So it's been a while since I published the latest episode, and it's been about a month, if I'm not mistaken. My apologies for being this late. It was just a bunch of things getting together and basically handicapping me to do some decent work. There was a lot of professional stuff going on, so that was taking up quite a bit of time. As you guys know, I'm doing this podcast in my free time, in my spare time. So whenever work gets hectic, it's always difficult. That was one aspect. There was some personal stuff also that I needed to handle. But the biggest issue was that about a month ago, Windows had a big update and it just messed up my computer. My laptop was increasingly unstable and a lot of things went wrong. It wasn't quite clear immediately in how bad a shape my laptop was, but I found out throughout time. So first thing that happened is that all my Microsoft Office programs, they were acting really weird, and then all of a sudden they stopped working. So I uninstalled and reinstalled a bunch of times. I looked online for hours on end trying to find if other people were going through the same thing. Turns out yes, but I tried a bunch of fixes, but nothing really worked. But nowadays, I finally have a more or less stable system right now. There's still some weird stuff going on. For instance, sometimes I start up my computer and then it fires up Excel right away. And then the next time I fire it up, it doesn't happen. So it's very unclear why that is the case. But there's some weirdness still remaining. But overall, my laptop is stable now. Because I do all my writing in Word, for instance, that's a big challenge to just be productive and just basically get some work done. Now, I do have an alternative that I've been using for about a year now, which is called Dragon Naturally Speaking. So that's just a piece of software that you talk into the headset and it just transcribes your words into Word or text or whatever. Well, that one stopped working too after the update. So it was same scenario. I had to uninstall and reinstall it a bunch of times. And if you've done this kind of stuff, you know how long that takes. So and now again, it's more or less fixed. It's this big issue. What I used to do a lot for my writing is because I spend so much time on the road, I will talk into my cell phone, make an MP3 recording, and then there's a transcribe function in this software. And I can just transcribe all the stuff that I dictated into my phone. And I've got reasonably good text. Well, that stopped working. So I had to then start manipulating the MP3 file, export it into a different format, which is the WAV format, so WAV. And I did that a bunch of times, but that was also giving iffy results. Then the accuracy was off. Anyway, so I had to find a new app for my phone, experiment with that, and now I've got that one figured out. So, but that's not all. There's more, obviously, because Mr. Murphy says that when things can go bad, they obviously go bad all the way. So Skype was working fine after the big Windows update. I used Skype to record my interviews with a specific piece of software called Pamela recording software, which is one of the pieces of software that Skype actually recommends. Been working with that for a long time, works great. All of a sudden, nothing. It just doesn't work anymore. So I spent hours online with the Microsoft help desk trying to figure this out. They took over my laptop remotely and they just tried a bunch of fixes. In the end, it's more or less functional, it's more or less working, but it isn't really fixed. So when I start recording, the sound level drops for me. So I can barely hear the other person anymore. Now, when I check the recording afterwards, all the sound is great. It's normal. But the moment that I'm recording, it's very difficult for me to understand what the other person is saying. So that makes it extremely difficult to do an interview. And I had a couple of interviews actually lined up. So I can say that now. So the first guest was Lee Morrison. Lee, who does the Urban Combatives really well. He's got a great program for self-defense. Excellent teacher, great guy. Somebody that I like a lot. And he was kind enough to take some time out of his busy schedule and to talk, and I just couldn't get the recording. It just didn't work. So I'm gonna have to reschedule, and I didn't want to reschedule until I have a decent computer again that I know that I'm not wasting his time. Same thing, Dan Doherty, one of my main instructors, the head of the Tai Chi Chuan organization that I am a part of. He also agreed to an interview, but again, I couldn't set a date because I didn't know if I was going to be able to record it. So that was a big issue in just figuring that out. I spent a few weeks trying to get that sorted out, and then when that was more or less okay, I ran into the problem with my microphone. I've got the Yeti microphone, which is a really good one that I purchased thanks to the support of my patrons. And that one just, I hadn't used it obviously because I wasn't recording any interviews. And there was a bunch of just these weird noises and distortion and that kind of thing. And I went through the whole song and dance once again. So reinstalling the drivers, looking for fixes online, all that kind of stuff. And eventually, it seems to be working now. I'm using it. I'm using the microphone as I speak. So looks like it's okay, but you can imagine that all this stuff here, all the many issues that I listed, it took up way too much time that I didn't have, and because I use Microsoft Office a lot for my job, I had a lot of backlog that had been piling up. So I've been working to get that done, and that eventually I was caught up with that. So that's the whole reason for the huge delay in the podcast. I haven't given up on the podcast. I'm not stopping. There wasn't anything along those lines. It was just computer problems from hell, basically. I hope, fingers crossed, I hope that I have that pretty much sorted out now, which is why I'm not recording this episode here. And I hope that I can also resume trying to get the interviews done with the guests. So my goal is to get the reschedule interviews now that I can do the recording more or less correctly, and then try to get those out as quickly as I possibly can. Now, in that regard, I'm a little bit dependent on obviously the schedule of my guests. So I'm going to have a difficult time really predicting when exactly that will be. But I can promise you this: as soon as I finish recording the interview, I will put it online as quickly as possible. So that's the first thing. That leads to two questions. Two different things, actually. So the first one is, let me know which guests you guys would like me to interview. I've got a long list of people that I'm trying to get on the show here, which I think will be interesting. But it dawned on me that I've asked this a while ago on my Facebook page, but it's been a while since I asked. So if you have people that you think would be interesting for me to interview, let me know, and I'll see if I can get in touch with them. As you know, this podcast is primarily geared towards self-defense, martial arts, and related concepts. So I'm probably not going to go out of my way to try and interview some singer or some boy band. So I hope you don't mind about that. That I'm giving a pass on that kind of stuff. But if you have ideas for interesting guests, I'm always open to suggestions. So hit me up on Facebook or on my blog. I'm going to post the show notes for this episode on my blog, and you can find it at wimsblog.com/20. So 20, the number 20, wimsblog.com/20. Go there, leave a comment there if you've got an idea for a guest, and I'll see it, and I'll see what I can do to make that happen. So that's the first thing. Second point that I want to address after this whole computer disaster, I decided to have a new goal on Patreon, and I just added that. So as you guys know, my blog, my podcast, all this is made possible thanks to Patreon. So if you're not familiar with Patreon, it's a way of basically helping people who create stuff, finance them, and help them getting that done. I've been on Patreon for almost a year and a half now. I've got a lot of content there. Videos, unique videos, you can't find them anywhere else. On instructional stuff, finance analysis, bunch of stuff. And I've been very fortunate to have a number of patrons support me, and that's actually what's paying for the podcast, the host of files, get all that done, and so on. So one of the things that Patreon lets you do is it asks you to have goals. So if you reach a certain amount of support per month, then you, as a creator, you promise to do something. So I managed to succeed in doing that for several rewards, and I added one, which is basically if we hit $1,750 twice in a quarter, I will get a dedicated computer for all my creation online. So that if you want to support me with that would be great. You can step in as low as $1 a month, and then it adds up, and the higher you go, the more you get. But and it's just a way to support the show and get that done. Now, the reason why I added this one is just to have another option, but to have a full stop on my online activities, basically, to if something goes wrong with my computer. I use the laptop obviously for work most of all, so that's why having a dedicated PC for my content creation would make a whole lot of sense. What I do with that mainly is, you guys know that I make a lot of videos, but it's also pictures that need to be edited, audio editing, the MP3 files that need to be created, all the recordings that I do, that also takes quite a bit of time. And currently I'm doing all that stuff on my own laptop. And just so you guys know a little bit of how that works, look at the number of videos that I put online, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Patreon, and so on. And pretty much all of them are in HD, so high definition. If I do a 15-minute video file, it takes about 25 minutes to half an hour to render it, to finish creating that, once I hit the render button. And while that's going on, there's pretty much zero I can do with my laptop, because all the hardware on the inside, the processor, the hard disk, and the RAM, it's all way too busy with creating that video file to let me use other programs. So that's a lot of time that I lose every single time I make a video. What I've been doing so far is trying to do that stuff when I normally, I wouldn't be working. So I usually render videos late at night when I'll just be doing other stuff. But again, it's that doesn't always work out. So sometimes I'm wasting a lot of time. So if you guys want to help me out with that, join me on Patreon. You're going to get a lot of fun stuff there. And that would actually help me get the podcast and everything else rolling much more fluidly. So that was the first big topic that I wanted to address. And then we can move on to the second one. I had planned to do something else, but recently I asked my patrons, do you have any questions for the quick Q&A, which is one of the videos that I do about 10 to 15 minutes every month, that people ask a question and I answer it. And there's this one that I thought, well, this would actually be a really good one to share here on the podcast, because it's something that I think a lot of people can relate to. And it's a question from Jacob, and he asked how to record techniques in writing exactly and concisely, because that is something I always struggle with at seminars. Do you have any good resources for learning a useful terminology? I'm a note taker myself. I have quite extensive notes for all the stuff that I do. Obviously, I've been writing instructional books and articles for almost 20 years now. So it's been a while. So I have some experience in that regard. And the way that my mind works kind of lends itself to that. So what I'd like to do in this episode now is just give you guys an overview of the different things that you can use to take your own notes, whether it's from a class that you follow, from a seminar, from a video that you're watching, doesn't matter. Just a way that you can then make those notes that they are the most efficient in putting down all the information that you need to have. So let me preface that by stating that anything that I say, it's great if you can use it. If you can't use it, equally great. You have your own take on it. You add your own stuff. You delete some of my stuff. Doesn't matter. Find your own way. Find a way that works best for you to take notes. What I'm going to do is just give you a description of the things that I like to use myself and that I found to be quite effective. Starting with the first one, and that is a filing system. So before you start making notes, you need to have a system of how you're going to organize all the notes that you're going to take, and do it in such a way that you can easily, might not be the best term, but you can efficiently organize everything that it stays practical, even if you've been taking notes for a long time. I would not propose to do all your notes in one big Word file or whatever file that you want to use, because that's going to be very difficult to search for unless you start basically structuring that file as a book, and you can use a navigation pane in Word to create some sort of, how should I put it, some sort of overview, like you have the table of contents in a book. You can do that, but I don't think that's the most efficient way of going about it. I think that might be quite frustrating after a while, because that's going to be a huge file and it's going to be difficult to page through everything. So I'm not a big believer in that. What I think you can do that would be a little bit more interesting, and I'll cover an alternative to this in the tips that I'm going to give at the end, is use a filing system where you have broad categories. So for instance, you create a folder on your hard disk where you are going to put all your notes. Then you create a bunch of subfolders and you branch out in that tree more and more, depending on what you're studying, what system that you practice. You can, pick how many categories you want. But for instance, let's start with, you have a folder, and in that one you put self-defense techniques. Then you have a subfolder, it's techniques against straight punches. And on the same level, subfolder, techniques against hook punches, techniques against grabbing techniques, techniques against takedowns, and so on. And then for instance, you take that folder that says techniques against takedowns, create a bunch of subfolders if you like, or individual files if that's the lowest level you want to go to, of first technique, second technique, and so on. So you create this structure that helps you figure out what where you put the things that you are going to take notes from. It's kind of having a classification system that needs to make sense for you first. So you don't really have to think about the technique too much before you open that file. As soon as you start reading, if you know that you open the file in the subfolder defense against throat grabs, you immediately have the context of what's going on with that technique. So that means that you can take your notes in a different fashion than if you do it differently. So that would be the first thing that I would suggest, is figure out what your filing system will be and figure out how that works best. Obviously, you can change it later on, but I found that changing it later on after you've been taking notes for a while, it often tends to be a little bit more difficult, because then you have to restructure the text and so on. And if you've been taking notes for years, that's quite a bit of work. My opinion is that it's better to figure out the filing system first and then stick to it as much as you can. Now, let's move on to the taking notes part first. And at the end of my explanation, I'm going to give you an example of one of mine that is available online, so you'll see what I mean a little bit better. So first things first, describe the context to begin with. So for instance, in your notes, one of the first lines is, what is this all about? Well, this is defense against a straight punch, for example. So at the very least, you set the scene of what's going on. The next thing you do is describe the orientation. So that means you have to figure out how you're standing and where your opponent or attacker is standing, how things are organized in that fashion. You can use, if you like, the clock system. So let's say you imagine a clock lying on the ground and he's at 12 o'clock and you're at 6 o'clock. That way you can very quickly decide how you're standing oriented towards him. You want to use a compass system, north, south, east, west, and so on. That's also perfectly fine. But you need to describe how the technique starts, as opposed to beginning with the punches already flying at your face. Because if you don't know where you start, you have no idea to understand what direction you're going into, where you're going to end up. It's just it's going to be a very vague description. So try to avoid that by making clear what the orientation is towards you and between you and your opponent. Then we move on to the next part, and that is describe the attack clearly. don't just stay straight punch at the face. It's not enough. Okay, which arm is doing the punch? Which part of his body is moving first? Which leg is coming forward? Where does it go? It's coming straight at you. It's going a little bit to the side and so on. So make a clear description of what the attack is. So when you read it next time, you look at that entry in your notes, which might be years later, so that it's very clear in your head what the attack looks like, as opposed to you have to guess, well, what does that mean? And then you can move on to the next part, and that is the position of your body in relation to the attacker. So it means that, well, how are you relating to him? And this is a form of shorthand that I like. So let's say he steps forward and you step either to the inside or the outside. So that's one way of describing your body in relation to him. Now that means that if he throws a right punch, so his right arm is sticky, he's throwing a right punch, and you step towards your left, and that's starting from him facing you. So he's at 12, you're at 6 o'clock. So you step to your left against that right arm punch of his. That means you're on the outside because you're away from his second arm. You're pretty much taking his back at this point. Now let's resume that same punch from the starting position. And if you step towards your right against his right punch, then you're on the inside because you're closer to his other arm. You're closer to his left arm now. And you're also closer to the front of his body. So that is referring to the inside. And it's a very easy distinction to make if you want to take a quick note. It says right straight punch coming at the face, move to the outside. You immediately can visualize where that is by distinguishing between inside and outside. Moving on to the next point. Now you want to describe your actions clearly then. So what do you do when that punch comes in? If you use footwork, well, where do you step? Where do you go? You can use the clock system again. You will step towards 3 o'clock, step towards 9 o'clock, step towards 10, 11, doesn't matter, but be as precise as you like to be. The compass system, step north or northwest, or you can use angles. You can say step 45 degrees, step 30 degrees, and so on. But if you use angles, make sure that you understand the angle in relationship to what. And very often that means in relationship to the straight line that you imagine between you and your opponent. Use that straight line and then step at an angle that is in relationship to that imaginary line. And that usually works quite well. So I'm a big fan of that. Moving on, what you want to also then describe is how exactly are your movements happening. And that's one of the key points that I found in many instances, is that people have a hard time with that because it's a little bit difficult to visualize that if it's been a while that you saw the technique. But what that means is you want to separate the types of movements as opposed to just thinking that they're all the same. So what happens simultaneously and what happens separately? For instance, he throws a punch at you, you step 45 degrees towards your left, but at the same time you are parrying with your left hand towards your right side. Now both of these actions, the footwork and the parry, happen at the same time. And you need to make that clear in your notes that these are two movements that happen simultaneously. Because otherwise it's going to be very difficult to visualize how that move looks. Again, not now, not when you learn it, but if you're at a seminar where you learn a lot of stuff in a short amount of time, or you haven't done the technique in a while, and you look at it after a year or so after you learned it first time and you took those notes, and you're going to have a hard time visualizing. So he attacks, you step to the left 45 degrees, and at the same time you parry. So that is simultaneous. However, afterwards, you're done parrying. Let's say that the technique is that you step forward with your right leg and then you punch him in the ribs. Now this second part is what happens next in the sequence. So then you look at your movements in sequence. It's not only what happens simultaneously, but also what happens first, what happens next, what happens after that. So, and this is part of your description so that you can very clearly line up your thoughts and visualize how the technique is going to have to be done in the way that you describe that. Typically what I do is I will start just type, for instance, like 1 punch comes in and step off line 45 degrees parry at the same time. New line, 2, step forward with your right leg and punch underneath his arm into his ribs. 3, also on a new line, step back and do a 360 degree scan, for instance. And that's so 3 clear, distinct steps, and the 3 steps are going to demonstrate a succession of movements, one after the other. And within those 3 steps, individually, there might be a lot of simultaneous movements. So the way that I'm making those notes will make it clear to me immediately, on a glance, watching my notes, I will know what is simultaneous and what is sequential. And that's a big thing, because I've noticed teaching that this is one of the things that many times students have a hard time following, is that they do stuff at the same time, or they separate movements that need to be done together, and then it always ends up they end up in the wrong place, or they can't make it work. So make a clear distinction between the simultaneous movements and then the separate movements that happen one after the other. Once you're done with all that, so once you're done with taking your notes, then I would add some key points or some common mistakes and so on. So some additional notes after the general description you just gave. And these are important because they will help you fill in the blanks and the details that you don't want to add to the general description, because that will interrupt the flow of you seeing the movement in your mind as you read it. So you use the description for a general impression of the technique, and you want to get an overall picture of what you and your opponent are doing. And then later in the notes afterwards, you're going to fill in the details. Because if you're too detailed in your note taking, that's going to take a long time for you to finish reading one small part of that technique. It's going to get really hard to visualize all those details in your mind's eye before you even get to the next line of notes with, again, a bunch of details already. Because don't forget, as you're reading, you're trying to visualize the technique in your mind. So the more details and descriptions up front, the more processing power in your brain, so to speak, you're going to have to use to just get a sense of what's actually going on. So my goal is always to paint a broad picture first and then use those notes for specific details. And when you read a technique, do it first without looking at the notes. So you look at the part 1, part 2, part 3, and so on, however you want to structure it. And that's just, okay, his hand goes over there, you step over there, now you do this, then you do that, and so on, and until you're done. And you get a gross motor skills, more or less equivalent to movement, meaning you want to have a picture that is broad enough so you can see what's going on, but you're not tuning in to fine details. Well, where exactly are you parrying? Is it on his elbow? Is it on the forearm? Is it at the wrist, and so on? Well, that's stuff that you can then add into the details. And that tends to clear up the picture that is in your mind's eye as you read the general description. So I would be a very big proponent of taking a lot of notes afterwards. Don't fill in the general description with a bunch of details, but do all that kind of stuff afterwards. You can go as deep and as wide as you want in your note taking. That's all up to you, and it depends on. For instance, I have specific notes on strategy and tactics. So I don't really fill that kind of stuff in my notes on specific techniques, barring some points that I think are relevant. But generally speaking, in my notes, I try to stay strictly adhering to the technical aspects of the technique. And I might perhaps in one of the notes after the general description say something, well, this fits well with strategy X or tactic Y, and then I can refer to my other notes on that specific topic. So in that way, I think you can have a pretty good note-taking system that you develop that works for you if you use all the elements that I just described. Now, I'll end up here with a couple of tips, and the first one is tip number 1: use terminology as some sort of shorthand. Now, what do I mean with that is that, for instance, if you practice Wing Chun, you know what a pak sao or a bong sao is. You know what that kind of movement looks like. So you don't have to start from scratch every time when you describe that you do that defensive action, and you don't have to start from scratch all the time with every single technique, because that's going to be a lot of note taking. So you just write Paxao, and then you know what's going on. For the style of Tai Chi that I use, for instance, grasping bird's tail, the high defense of that is a clear movement that is one of the first defensive actions that you learn in the style. So you very quickly get comfortable with that, and it's very distinctive. You know what it looks like. So I just write GBT, and that's short for grasping bird's tail, step to the outside, for instance. And then I would add 7-star step, because 7 stars is a specific type of footwork, as opposed to 9 palace step, which is also a different type of footwork. If you're not familiar with the style I practice, that doesn't make any sense to you. But to me and to my students, that makes perfect sense. We know exactly which kind of footwork and which movement the notes are describing when I say defense against right haymaker, 7 stars footwork to the inside, grasping bird's tail, defense high. And immediately that first movement is clear. There's no doubt about it. It also at the same time will handle, does this happen simultaneously? Does this happen sequentially? Because if you know the technique, you know very well what that needs to look like. So that is going to save me sentence after sentence of description if I can just use this kind of terminology. 2 things with that. First of all, you have to make sure that you're right, so that you're not mistaking techniques one for the other, which tends to happen sometimes in martial arts. And the second is be very clear in what you mean when you start using abbreviations like that. You can make a list if you like, but be very clear in the meaning of that technique. What I mean with that is that, for instance, grasping bird's tail has a high and a low component to it. So I have to be clear that it's high or low. If I don't add that to my description, then the terminology is failing me, because it leaves doubt again. Because then I have to be precise in a different part. So that is something that I would try to figure out for the style that you practice, is if there's specific terminology that you can use for techniques, for postures, for concepts, for whatever you want, use that, but be clear in your mind what that exactly means. So that's the first tip. Moving on to the second one, draw a picture. When you take your notes, just make a quick illustration. If you have the time for it, you can draw stickmen and illustrate that way, or just draw some dots on the page so that it shows where the guy is standing, where you're standing. Draw some arrows so on the page that illustrate the footwork that you're using. Whatever you want to do, but it doesn't have to be comic book level quality drawings. Obviously, it can be very crude, very very limited. You should see some of my drawings. I can't really draw well, but I'm enthusiastic, but I'm not skilled. But they're a quick way to make notes as an addition to the things you write down, the words you write down. So that really helps if you can do that while you're taking your notes, because it's going to help you visualize again the technique. And once again, like I said before, if you're at a seminar, you're seeing dozens of techniques on one day, it's going to be difficult to remember everything. And then a quick drawing can actually really speed up your how should I put it? Speed up the process of then processing all the notes and writing them out fully into whatever files that you use on your computer. Which brings me to the last tip, and that would be to use a personal Wikipedia, a personal wiki. So everybody knows Wikipedia. Well, there's actually different kinds of different software systems that you can download for free, and they let you do a wiki on your computer. So you have your own personal equivalent of a Wikipedia for your martial art or self-defense system. In most of the cases, it's pretty easy to get the hang of working with that software. The navigation tends to be straightforward. It makes it relatively easy to just keep track of your notes, but also structure things in such a way that you can just click on one link, click on the next one, and that you're just very quickly going from one page to the next as you read about a specific technique. That reminds me, okay, I want to see how this compares to this technique. You hit one click and you're at the next part of your personal wiki. You could obviously also add some pictures, drawings, movies, and so on if you want to. So all that is possible in the navigation and in the software. And I will add to the show notes a list of personal wikis that you can use, that you can download. I think all of them are free. I personally like WikiDpad. There's a discussion online on whether you say WikiDpad or WikidPad. I'm not going to get into that. But I personally like that one. You don't have to use that, but I think it works quite well. And if you don't like that one, see if one of the others is also more to your liking. But if you take prolific notes, I would very much suggest using that kind of software as opposed to Word or any other thing. It also, at the same time, helps you get rid of all the separate files that you have on your hard disk. And then the filing system I explained at the beginning is not going to be necessary anymore. One of the main downsides of such a filing system is that if you put a Word document where you describe a specific technique in, you put it in the wrong folder, you save it in the wrong folder, then it's going to get messy. If you look for specific techniques, you can't find them, and you've got dozens and dozens of files already after several years of note taking. A personal wiki kind of gets you around that issue. So you don't really have to look at hard drive files, but you can just add entries, and the software automatically takes care of how it organizes itself to keep the content on your hard disk. So that would be my suggestion for how you should go about it, taking notes. What I would like you to do is take a look at a video I posted on my Facebook page, and it's called Grasping Bird's Tail Basic Application. I'll put a link to it directly in the show notes. And also, again, go to wimsblog.com/20. And that is the landing page for this episode. And I'll put a direct link there because it's facebook.com/ a bunch of numbers and so on. So you can click it there. And in that video, I explain in detail how you should do that technique. Now, one word of caution, this is me going into instructor mode. So that means that I'm teaching. I'm not writing for myself. I'm teaching for other people. So I'm giving the instructions that go along with the video so it makes sense. So you understand what's going on, why you do things a certain way. I also give some context. I also give some contrast. Okay, that is why we're doing it. Normally we do it this, but blah, blah, blah. And there's a whole bunch of explanations there. And try to look at that text, maybe within the context of everything that I described here before. So look at, what kind of technique is it? What is the orientation, sequential or simultaneous movement, and so on. So all the things that I explained before, you'll see parts of that in the description of on that video. So again, I would very much suggest you look at that and then figure out, okay, how can I apply the same principle to my own note-taking? I believe note-taking is very helpful. It's not for everybody. Some people, they really don't feel comfortable with that. But if it's you, if you can be bothered to do a decent amount of note-taking, I think in the long term it can really benefit you. And it'll help you. Again, one of the things, I'm 46 now, and I remember, and this is a long time ago, I remember my dad, just after I graduated from high school, looking at the graduation picture, and he said, you should write down the names of everybody, because you might forget those after a while. And I remember thinking at that point in time, there's no way I will ever forget this guy and that guy and this girl and so on. There's no way I will always remember who that is. And it didn't even take 15 years afterwards that I was like, crap, who the hell was that again? I'm blanking on the name, and so on. And now it's been a very long time. So since I was 18. So as a result, I look at that picture now, and there's just a bunch of people there, and I'm like, okay, I recognize the face. I have a bunch of memories of how that went during high school, but I have no idea what that person's name is anymore. The point of this little story is this: your memory is not static. It changes. It changes constantly. And it very much changes when you look at the long term of several years or decades. So techniques that you learn now if you don't take any notes, you're going to have a very different opinion of them and recollection of them, let's say in about a year, 10 years, or even 40 years if you train that long. And that is the value of notes, is that it kind of freezes that moment in time. It freezes your thought process. It freezes the context within you learned that. And then you can look at that technique in a clear, honest way. And then years later decide, well, okay, I've changed my mind, or I don't think this is accurate, or this is good, but I would, given all the insight and experience that I have now, I would do this a little bit differently. But you have an honest record of how you learn that technique. And I think that is a value of note keeping that is often overlooked. It's not just to help you remember a technique, it's to see it within the larger context that is how you will view what you learn over a long period of time as you change and as you have experiences in the world. As you learn other things, you learn different styles. You have self-defense experience when people attack you and so on. So that is, in my opinion, the true value of taking good notes. And that's also why I wanted to do this episode on the way that I like to take notes. And hopefully that's going to help you out in your own note-taking. So that's pretty much it, Jacob. I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, again, you just leave me a note on the Patreon page, and I will get back to you there. And that automatically brings us to the end of this episode. So as always, don't forget, go to wimsblog.com/20. That's going to be the page where you can see all the show notes, where I'll put everything up. Also, if you want to support the show, again, I'd be very grateful. Just the minimum that you can do, obviously, is like, share, subscribe, join me on social media and so on. Let people know that you think that they might have a use for this kind of information. And obviously, you're more than welcome to join me on Patreon. That is what allows me to do the podcast. It's the support of you guys, of all my patrons, that is making the difference. So I want to thank you all again for listening, and I hope to talk to you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Demeere podcast. For more information, go to www.wimsblog.com.